right, so really cancer biology probably comes down to this question, or possibly how do I avoid getting cancer is an even more pertinent question. What causes cancer? We have quite a bit of epidemiological data to back up what sorts of things cause cancers. Anybody know what epidemiology is? How diseases spread. So looking at statistics and correlations, that sort of data. We have a lot of epidemiological data that looks at statistics correlating certain behaviors and cancer risk, and then that can get backed up by individual researchers as well. So the first thing that we can say without a doubt is that cancer rates increase dramatically with age. Cancer is much, much more common in people over 60 than it is people under 60. And that's true across the board of different kinds of cancers. The place where it gets a little bit sticky is on leukemia, but you see a huge risk factor for colon cancer in people who fall into the 60 to 79 age group. Much higher risk for lung cancer rates if you're over 60, much higher rates for prostate cancer risk if you're over 60 as well. We see that time and time again, and on average, the risk for people 60 and over is about 1,000 times. You guys want me to close that? That's fine, right? So age is definitely the greatest risk factor that we can see for developing cancer. Now, some scientists have suggested that perhaps cancer is an expected outcome of aging. Perhaps this is a normal consequence that's sort of built into the aging process in our genes. As evolutionary biologists, you've been through Bio 1A. Does that alarm you? Yeah. Because the other side of it is, well, if that's true, then why would our genes be passed on to the next generation? What's your answer to that, though? Cancer risk goes up when you're after you're able to reproduce. So these genes would be passed on when you're younger because the cancer risk hasn't kicked in until you're over 60. So it doesn't exclude that as a possibility. Perhaps this is a normal process that's actually coded in our genes to develop cancer past the age of 60. Wouldn't be mitigated by the evolutionary process and natural selection because our genes are passed on before that cancer risk hits us. So definitely that is a possibility. One theory for why that would be is overpopulation, lack of resources, sort of getting rid of those who can no longer be reproductively valuable to the population. Remember, evolution cares about us all the way up until we reproduce, and it doesn't care anymore. Right? That's how the process works. So it doesn't preclude that as a possibility. We don't have any data to back it up, but theories as to why this risk would exist at such a higher rate. Now, the other thing is you guys know that cancer isn't one mutation that allows one activity. Think back to what a cell has to do in order to become cancerous. Right? What are the things it has to do? So density independence, that has to gain density independence, okay? What else? Has to lose anchorage dependence because of the proteins called integrins that attach it to a surface. It has to, what else? Has to go through angiogenesis. If it's going to grow, the tumor is going to grow beyond 2 millimeters, so it's got to find some way to trigger angiogenesis. And then on the other side of that, it has to do what to the other guys that are get rid of the inhibitor. So there's all of these things that have to happen before, and we're just like at the tip of the iceberg here, right? Then proteases, so it can spread, and it goes on and on. So there's multiple mutations that have to happen before a certain cell can become a cancerous tumor. Never mind metastasizing, that's a whole other list of things that it has to gain those functions for. So it could simply take time for all of those mutations to accumulate. That could be another reason why age is so highly associated as a high cancer risk, because it takes that much time to get through all of those mutations before a cell can become cancerous. Interestingly enough, only 1% of cancer cases are in children, and by far the highest rates for children are for leukemia, which is blood cancers, and lymphoma, which is cancers of immune cells. Those are more frequent in children and people under the age of 30 than they are in adults, interestingly enough. So those types of cancers are specifically associated with younger people. So another risk factor that we can identify using epidemiological data: environmental and lifestyle factors playing a prominent role in triggering the development of cancer. Here we're looking at different types of cancer, and we're looking at the risk for developing those cancers according to where you live in the world. For example, stomach cancer. The risk for stomach cancer for someone who lives in Japan is 14 times higher than somebody who lives in Uganda. But if we look at the risk for breast cancer, your risk is much higher if you live in the United States, for example, than Algeria. So it's very different depending on where you live in the world. So why could that be? Diet? Okay. So you're thinking something environmentally in that population? What else could it be? Pollution? Social factors, okay. Anybody thinking? So how close you are to the equator could possibly? Do we see that link? We don't see a clear link on that, so I'm looking for being near one another. Anybody want to ask about genetics? Right. If you're coming from Uganda, you may have a similar genetic background, so maybe it's genetics because you come from that part of the world. You have a certain type of gene mutation that raises your risk or lowers your risk. So for sure we can see particular kinds of cancer are more common in different parts of the world. Without a doubt, we can follow that. And certain countries have higher risk for certain types of cancer. So a person's risk for developing a certain kind of cancer is significantly affected by the country in which they live. So the risk factors that we see in the United States, where lung cancer, prostate cancer, breast cancer, colon cancer are some of our highest risks. Of course, skin cancer is always number one, but these are some of the other major big ones. In this country, it's not necessarily true in other countries. And the question really comes down to, is this genetic or is this environmental? We all come from one population, one genetic background. That isn't as true in the United States as it is in some countries, but perhaps that genetic background puts you at a higher risk for that type of cancer. Or is it, as you guys were supposing, pollution, similar diets, social interactions? Perhaps it's some environmental effect. So, how do we test for that? Very elegant way to do this. Make a move, or how about people who just want to move on their own? Immigrants. Perfect. We look at immigrant populations. What happens if you move from a place that has a really high stomach cancer risk? So let's say someone moves from Japan, right, where their stomach cancer risk is incredibly high, and they move to the United States, where their stomach cancer risk is much lower. The question is, what happens to them with their stomach cancer risk? What about the next population, the next generation? Well, that work was done. If we follow immigrants, their cancer rates resemble the rates of their new country, not the country from their genetic background or where they immigrated from. So it's genetic or environmental? Environmental. So here's some data to back this up. We're looking at stomach cancer risk. Remember, stomach cancer risk was high in Japan. So male with a Japanese heredity background living in Japan, high stomach cancer risk. If that individual moves to California, the risk goes down. Here's the risk for a native Californian. Right? So for comparison, risk for a native Californian, risk for a native in Japan. Okay. Here, an immigrant from Japan to California. He's dropped his risk just by simply moving to California. Now, next generation, he has a son. That son, same genetic background, grew up in California. His risk factor is getting closer and closer to the native population. This works the other way around. If you have, if you look at colon cancer risk and you look at immigration, colon cancer risk is quite low in the Japanese population. If that individual moves to California, his risk goes up. Next generation, the risk goes up even higher, almost the same as the risk of a native Californian. So it appears that immigrants take on the risk factor of their new country, of where they've moved to, indicating this is an environmental effect. This is not genetic, or largely environmental, not purely genetic. So calculations based on data like this shows that calculations indicate that environmental factors account for 80 to 90% of a person's cancer risk. Genetics only accounts for 10 to 20% of a person's cancer risk. This is overall. There are certain cancers where this is different. So for example, I know you guys know about breast cancer and the BRCA genes, right? Those genes are very, breast cancer is much tighter to the hereditary risk. But overall, if we look at all cancer risk, most of your cancer risk, the vast majority of it, comes from environmental factors as opposed to genetic background. Interesting other piece of data that backs this up, one that you guys probably know already, not probably, certainly know already. There have been several cancers that have been identified at a higher rate in certain groups of people that share an environmental factor or a lifestyle factor, but not heredity. For example, you're fully aware that smoking causes cancer, right? From the time you were born, you were aware of that fact. That's been known for quite a while now, that cigarette smoking causes cancer. But this was actually a revolutionary idea, because lung cancer was incredibly rare up until about the 1920s. It was an incredibly rare thing for a doctor to even see a case of lung cancer. In fact, I was looking at data that said up until 1895, I think it was, a total of 142 cases of lung cancer have been diagnosed worldwide. So it is an incredibly rare form of cancer. And they talk about how if a doctor heard about a lung cancer case, he would rush to the hospital to see this case because he would probably never see another lung cancer case again. That's how uncommon it was to see a lung cancer case. Incredibly uncommon. What happened, however, was in 1888, or well, before that point, let me back up here. Cigarettes were very expensive in the 1800s, extremely expensive because they had to be hand-rolled. In 1881, they developed a machine that would machine roll cigarettes, and they became much cheaper. And cigarette consumption rose dramatically. Now, they didn't see this link at first. What the doctors first saw was a huge increase in lung cancer cases. So right around the 1920s or so, they start to see an increase in this lung cancer development. And so doctors couldn't figure it out because lung cancer had been so rare. All of a sudden, so many people are coming in with lung cancer. So they started to ask questions, and they discovered that almost every single person who walked in the door with lung cancer smoked cigarettes. So then we overlap data looking at cigarette consumption in purple, right, compared to male lung cancer deaths in green. And we see it's the same shaped curve, but if you notice, it takes 25 years on average to develop lung cancer. That's why the curve is shifted 25 years that direction. And we can use data like this to anticipate that the average person who starts smoking today, their risk for lung cancer is highest in 25 years from now. That's about how long it takes to develop cancer. So they saw tobacco smoke is responsible, currently we estimate for about 1/3 of all cancer deaths are caused by tobacco smoke. That includes lung cancer as well as some cancers of the throat and pharynx, etc., where we see risks going up for those individuals as well. Notice once this data was accumulated, and at first they didn't trust it, of course, huge industry relies on tobacco products, but at first they didn't trust this link. And then what would happen is you started to see a decline in cigarette consumption, and you see a 25-year later decline in lung cancer cases in males. So it actually fits the data really well. When cigarette consumption goes down, 25 years later, we see our lung cancer risk go down as well. The other thing that was interesting about this data, actually I just said this, that lung cancers take about 25 years to develop, is that all of these early cases of lung cancer were almost always males. And in fact, it became a huge point of contention from tobacco manufacturers as to if tobacco and cigarette consumption really did cause cancer, because it didn't see that data in women. Females did not actually start smoking on a regular basis until the 1940s, about 20 years after males started smoking. So usage of tobacco products by women was much fewer percentage than we saw in men until about the 1940s. So it's no surprise that it took about 20 years later before we see that risk factor starting to climb. So yes, it does appear that smoking causes lung cancer death in women as well as men. It's not just in men. It certainly is associated with women. At this point, the risk has actually surpassed breast cancer. So in the United States, lung cancer is the #1 killer of cancers for women. So it has surpassed breast cancer, which used to be #1. And it all comes down to cigarette consumption for these deaths. Some other data to back this up, lots of data on looking at the relationship between cigarette smoking and lung cancer. We can see that lung cancer rate is directly proportional to the number of cigarettes smoked per day. So this is cigarettes smoked per day, relative risk of dying of lung cancer. So non-smoker, low risk. If you smoke, 1 to 14 cigarettes per day, risk goes up. More than 25, risk goes up even higher. So we can see a direct relationship between the number of cigarettes smoked and the cancer risk, the risk of dying. We can also see risk factor associated with the age that an individual started smoking. The earlier they started smoking, the higher their risk of dying of lung cancer. And the depth of inhalation. That always makes me think of Clinton. Is that too young for your recollection? You remember that? Yes, but I didn't inhale. Yes. So those who inhale deeply the cigarette smoke have a much higher risk than those who don't. And this is all makes sense. If the tobacco smoke is causing cancer, then of course, the longer your exposure, the higher the exposure, the more deeply you inhale that smoke, the more likely you're going to get cancer and die from lung cancer. If we put all of this together, the typical heavy smoker, heavy smokers are defined by a pack or more per day. The typical heavy smoker has about a 2,500% higher risk of lung cancer than a non-smoker. Right? That's huge. So a huge risk factor associated with smoking. So we can definitely see this one. This is one that has been investigated the most fully, where we have a lot of data to back up what's happening with lung cancer and cigarette smoke. So, how does tobacco smoke, cigarette smoke, cause lung cancer? What's that relationship here? Tobacco smoke contains more than 4,000 different chemicals. When they analyze each one individually and they look to see if it's what we call a carcinogen or cancer-causing, you guys know this term. Right, or a cancer-causing chemical that we've identified as increasing the cancer risk, over 40 of them are actually identified as carcinogenic if we inject it into an animal. So if we split up all of those different 4,000 different chemicals and we inject each one into animal studies, what we find is that 40 of them are associated with a higher cancer risk in those animal studies. Interestingly enough, several of the chemicals in this group of 40 are actually considered high risk if you encounter them in the workplace. So there's all these OSHA regulations about how you have to deal with this chemical if you were in the workplace, but you can suck it into your lungs anytime you want in your cigarette. So it's kind of weird the way that's being regulated. Dangerous in the workplace, but available to anyone. Now, several of these carcinogenic chemicals cause DNA mutations. That's ultimately how they're going to result in cancer. Several of these chemicals cause DNA mutations that trigger a mutation in the gene. This is all the early steps of developing cancer. Perhaps they cause a DNA mutation in P53, reducing the likelihood of apoptosis. Perhaps they cause a DNA mutation so that the cell no longer relies on integrins. Right? These are the sorts of mutations we're talking about. Several of these chemicals they've identified cause specific DNA mutations that then trigger a mutation in the gene. We've seen that smoking, in addition to increasing your risk for lung cancer, also increases your risk for multiple other cancers, including cancer of the mouth, pharynx, larynx, esophagus, stomach, pancreas, uterus, kidney, bladder, colon, and your risk for leukemia. All go up for a heavy smoker. So it increases the risk for multiple other cancers. So if we kind of put all of that together, the estimate is that it causes about 400,000 deaths per year in the United States. They're also not just, so this is lung cancer risk, right? So this is lung cancer deaths. It's other cancers that were caused by the smoking, so it could be bladder, kidney, that list I just went through. Right? If they're identified as a heavy smoker and they died of another form of cancer, they would be in that group. It also is smoking-related disease, so heart disease or stroke that was brought on by smoking. So this is all cigarette smoking-associated diseases included together. So out of 2 million deaths every year in the United States, 400,000 of them are likely caused by cigarettes, a huge factor. Now, the question that I usually get at this point is, well, if I'm not a smoker, but I'm worried about secondhand smoke, right? So what's the risk factor for someone who maybe isn't smoking themselves, but is affected as a secondhand smoke inhalation? Secondhand smoke does raise the risk by about 30% compared to someone who never has contact with secondhand smoke. So it does raise the risk, but remember, for a smoker, it was 25,000 or 2,500 times, so it definitely raises the risk, not nearly as dramatically. There are some dose-response curves showing the more exposure you have, the higher your risk goes, an average of 30%, but certainly there are some dose-response curves that show that same relationship we saw with first-hand smoking. That is a brand new discussion. They don't have much data on it yet. It's being compiled, but they don't have a lot of data on it yet. Third-hand smoking.
What's that?
When you inhale fumes from somebody's clothing, those sorts of things. So you're not directly inhaling the smoke. So secondhand smoke raises the risk by about 30%. Interesting, they do have some specific data on secondhand smoke as opposed to firsthand smoke. It appears to increase the concentration of angiogenesis stimulators. Remember VEGF, right? The growth factor there that's associated with angiogenesis. It appears that those who are exposed, especially to high levels of secondhand smoke, have a lot of VEGF in their bloodstream. So we can see that likely what's happening is the exposure to secondhand smoke is actually increasing those angiogenesis stimulators in the bloodstream, and therefore increasing your risk for cancer. The estimate currently is of all lung cancers, about 15% of lung cancer patients likely got it through secondhand exposure. So 15% of all lung cancer cases were acquired by secondhand exposure as opposed to firsthand exposure.
I took an epidemiology class and they talked about third-hand smoke being the least, risk.
Yeah.
And then second-hand smoke, the air that you blow out would be the second
Right.
And then the fumes that are coming out of the cigarette itself is actually the highest risk because it burns hotter and contains more carcinogens.
So they consider secondhand what's coming out of somebody, a smoker. So a smoker exhales and you inhale that.
I think it's both secondhand smoke, but the one that burns out of the cigarette and
Right.
the one that you blow out, but it's just different like rates of carcinogens because
Right.
it's been filtered through not only the cigarette
But then somebody else's lungs.
Yeah, exactly. And the other one burnt, it's just burnt tobacco.
And third-hand smoke was fumes from
clothes and
yeah,
stuff,
clothes
and
and
that's
stuff
has
like
the
that.
lowest risk.
Okay. All right, not to totally ruin your weekend, but I've got more good news. Alcohol and cancer risk. Right. So, alcohol is associated with an increased risk of developing several types of cancer. Generally, it's the cancers where alcohol has direct contact with it. So cancers of the mouth, the throat, the esophagus, the stomach, etc., is where we see the greatest risk for alcohol. Now, in addition to raising the risk for several types of cancer, alcohol is also the main cause of liver cirrhosis. You guys know what liver cirrhosis is? When you have long-term inflammation in the liver, it builds up scar tissue, and that scar tissue is called cirrhosis. So it's scarring of the liver, when the liver has lots of scar tissue developing on it, and that impedes function. This is commonly a precursor to liver cancer. Having liver cirrhosis raises your risk for liver cancer dramatically. So therefore, alcohol is associated with liver cancer, but because alcohol causes the cirrhosis, and the cirrhosis then leads to likely liver cancer, because all that inflammatory action can lead to a higher cancer risk. Now, interestingly enough, alcohol on its own is a weak carcinogen. It does not cause significant mutations if we look at the DNA. It doesn't seem to cause mutations at a very high rate whatsoever. Remember, that's how tobacco smoke worked. Tobacco smoke was full of carcinogens that caused DNA mutations, but that's not how alcohol works. So how is alcohol raising your risk for cancer if it's not causing those same carcinogenic mutations? It appears that repeated exposure to alcohol causes tissue damage to the tissue that it contacts, and your natural tissue response is to repair and replace that tissue, right, through tissue growth. The normal cell cycle, if there's lots of tissue damage, the cells will go through division to replace that damaged tissue. This is part of the normal activity in a tissue to replace this damaged area. Well, if you're triggering cell proliferation, that can lead to overproliferation in cancer, and that's the current thinking on alcohol, is that it's repeated exposure causing these cells to proliferate in response to the damage, which can raise the risk for cancer. Now, this is actually kind of backed up by the idea that alcohol acts synergistically with tobacco to increase cancer risk. In this case, they're looking at oropharyngeal cancers, so cancer of the mouth, the pharynx, those areas. They're looking at various different cancers in that area, and they're comparing cancer risk for someone who is a heavy drinker but doesn't smoke, right? A non-drinker but a heavy smoker, and here's the risk if you're a heavy drinker and a heavy smoker. Through the roof. Showing that alcohol and tobacco work synergistically when we're talking about oropharyngeal cancers. So the risk is much higher, even than if you add the two together, it's much higher because they're somehow working together to trigger these oropharyngeal cancers. So your safest bet is to choose none, but if you can't do that, then choose just one, right? For that type of cancer anyway. So what it turns out is the current thinking, remember, tobacco smoke contains the carcinogens that create DNA mutations. And alcohol stimulates proliferation of cells. So if they're working together, what's happening likely is the tobacco causes the mutation, the alcohol causes those mutated cells to proliferate, and you wind up with cancer. Right? They work synergistically together. Cancer in those tissues where it's contacting regularly. So the risk is much higher in this combination. So we've walked through kind of the big one that we can identify surely as a large cause of cancer. Other ones that are we have some epidemiological data to back up along these lines. Diet and cancer. There's been a lot of talk about pesticides and the possible development of cancer. There's been lots of research done on that area. The data is actually really unclear as to what's happening with pesticides, both synthetic and natural pesticides. Natural pesticides are things produced by the fruit or vegetable normally that inhibit the growth of microorganisms or inhibit bugs from eating them, etc. So it's a natural product made by that fruit or vegetable. So many synthetic and natural pesticides have been identified as possibly carcinogenic. They have tested a whole group of them, and they find both some synthetic ones as well as natural ones. Natural pesticides that they find in apples and cauliflower and mushrooms and raspberries have all been identified as carcinogens as well. So there's a huge number of pesticides, both natural and synthetic, that have some sort of carcinogenic risk and can cause cancer. When we look at how much the average American is actually exposed to of these chemicals, on a daily basis, the average American is exposed to 0.05 to 0.1 milligrams of synthetic pesticides a day. 0.05 to 0.1 milligram. The average American is exposed to 1,500 milligrams of natural pesticides per day, both of which have been identified to be carcinogenic. So definitely we see these chemicals, they are in the fruits and vegetables, they are able to cause cancer when we look at those chemicals individually. However, so this, by the way, indicates that over 99% of the pesticides we encounter are actually natural ones that are made by those fruits and vegetables. However, we cannot find a risk factor with eating these fruits and vegetables and developing cancer. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. Fruit and vegetable consumption is correlated with a lower cancer risk. So the data is really unclear on what does this mean. Yes, we know some of these pesticides can cause cancer. If you take one of them out of that fruit or vegetable and you inject it into the animal, you can get carcinogenic effects. But our epidemiology approach shows that that's not likely to be true because people who eat fruits and vegetables don't have a higher risk. In fact, eating lots of fruits and vegetables decreases the cancer risk. So the current thought is that fruits and vegetables contain both possible carcinogens as well as anti-carcinogenic chemicals. So probably it's the balance of the two that's getting rid of that cancer risk. For example, you've heard of like lycopene in your tomatoes. Right? Lycopene in the tomatoes, which has been associated with a lowering of cancer risk, especially associated with prostate cancer risk. So interestingly enough, lycopene seems to function just fine even when it's been cooked. So you get it from ketchup and tomato sauce and all that as well. It seems to function even after the fruit or vegetable has been cooked. Other examples here, resveratrol, which is found in the skin of red grapes. So you've heard that red wine drops your cancer risk. Well, this is what they're quoting when they say that. This is a natural anti-carcinogenic chemical found in the skin of red grapes. Sulfites. That's what's in garlic. When they talk about how garlic reduces your cancer risk, they've identified they have sulfites, and that actually lowers your cancer risk. So it appears that fruit and vegetable consumption actually lowers your cancer risk, even though we know some of the chemicals in them are carcinogenic. So it's some kind of a balancing act.
This might be a little off topic.
That's okay.
But why on when you're going to places like soup plantations, they have pickles warning this contains sulfites as if it's a bad thing?
As a preservative. They're using them as a preservative. And some people are sensitive to them. They have allergic reactions. So that's why they're worried about that.
I was going to ask the same thing. You see it in wine.
Yeah, they use them as and sulfides too are different. So they're using them as preservatives, and some people have a really bad allergic reaction to them. All right, so it appears to be some sort of a combination of the two in the fruits and vegetables. So definitely eat your fruits and vegetables. Your doctor didn't lie to you. They definitely do decrease the overall cancer risk. The one exception to this rule is aflatoxin, or one of the exceptions. There are a couple that we identify. That particular natural product has a very high cancer risk. Aflatoxin is one of them. In fact, it is the most potent and dangerous of the naturally occurring chemicals that we've identified for cancer risk. Aflatoxin is extremely potent carcinogen. It's produced by a mold. It's a toxin produced by this mold called Aspergillus. Aspergillus will grow on nuts and grains, so it'll grow every now and then. You're almost every now and then you'll see the big, the big grain silos. See, sometimes the Californian kids look at me like the what? Like the big round things where they store the grain in the fields, like in Wisconsin and stuff. Right? So the great big grain silos, if a little bit of moisture gets into that grain silo, it can grow the mold Aspergillus. And then that can release aflatoxin. And aflatoxin is extremely dangerous. It actually has several different medical effects, but it is an extremely potent carcinogen as well. So it really comes from moist environment where this organism is growing. Don't see it very commonly in the United States because of use of pesticides, actually, because the pesticides will kill off Aspergillus. So you don't see it very commonly. Where you see this problem showing up is in parts of Africa and Asia. Parts of Africa and Asia where it's a more humid environment, they're not readily using the pesticides that we use. The grain, the nuts, etc. can get moist and grow this fungus on them, which then releases aflatoxin. And interestingly enough, those same parts of the world, you can overlap a map showing parts of the world where aflatoxin exposure is highest, where the parts of the world where liver cancer rates are highest. So it appears that liver cancer, one of the risk factors, is exposure to aflatoxin. So you see a high risk in parts of Asia and Africa, and it likely comes from exposure to this aflatoxin. In fact, a very strong mutagen is one of the most potent ever studied. A dose of, don't memorize this, this is just supposed to be a shocking statistic. A dose of 0.0001 grams, so 1 grams of the aflatoxin, that dosage given to rats, and you spread that amount out over 16 months, right? So for 16, spread over 16 months, given to rats in a study is enough to kill every single rat from liver cancer. Okay. That's crazy to think about. So that's a tiny, tiny dosage. It's extremely potent. That amount will kill every rat that they put it into if you spread that dosage out over a time frame. All right. Another topic that comes up, food preservation techniques. Food preservation techniques may raise the risk for cancer. Data is not 100% clear yet on that. We definitely see a higher stomach cancer risk in countries where they eat lots of smoked or cured or pickled foods. So higher stomach cancer. Remember, Japan fell into this group. So anywhere where people are eating lots of smoked meats or cured meats or pickled foods is where you're starting to see a risk in stomach cancer. So it could be that food preservation technique is associated with cancer risk. Several ideas were out there on what's causing this. It could be a salt intake because those foods will have a higher amount of salt in them. It could be the nitrites and nitrates that are used and produced during those preservation processes. Both of those have been postulated as what could be going on. Salt itself is not carcinogenic. So if you just use salt as a chemical to inject into the animals, it is not carcinogenic on its own. However, high levels of salt intake causes damage to the stomach lining. It can cause inflammation in the stomach lining, and that could leave you open to other carcinogens. So it could be that the high salt damages the stomach lining, which then raises your risk for other chemicals to cause the cancer. So high salt damages stomach lining. Nitrates and nitrites, these are, the reason I'm not supposed to eat hot dogs right now, like preservatives. So nitrates and nitrites, you hear about those as food preservatives. Neither one of those are very carcinogenic if they're injected into an animal on their own. So they don't show carcinogenic properties on their own. However, there has been data to show that the nitrites and the nitrates that are in the meat or in our bodies could be converted to a carcinogenic compound by the meat proteins, meat enzymes, or our bodies. So even though they don't show carcinogenic properties on their own, it's possible they get changed into something that's carcinogenic by our metabolism or by metabolic enzymes that are actually in the meat. It is hard to know for sure exactly what's going on with this cancer risk, because countries that eat a lot of smoked, cured, and pickled foods also have a lower fruit and veggie consumption per person on average. So it's a little bit difficult to know, is it the ingestion of this that's causing the problem, or is it the reduced fruit and veggie ingestion that's causing the problem? This is the problem with human data, so it's a little bit difficult to piece it all apart and know exactly what's going on.
I remember reading that nitrites and nitrates produce cancer carcinogens when they're heated, when they're cooked.
I don't know. Did you read a scientific paper? Okay, then likely it's, I didn't write down the name of the compound that it gets turned into, but I actually have it in my book. I can look it up. You can see if that's a heat run reaction. I know that there are enzymes that come from our liver that will actually turn them into various different cancerous compounds. And they exist in the meat as well.
I heard the same thing, like this no barbecue meat.
Oh, that's different. Actually, I am going to get to that one. The temperature causes fats to release hydrocarbons that are associated with cancer. We'll talk about that in a second. All right, so again, food preservation techniques. Definitely we see a higher risk, especially for stomach cancer, when people eat, especially if they're in parts of the world where they eat lots of cured meats and pickled foods. But we're not 100% sure if that's something from that process or if that's the reduced fresh fruit and veggie consumption that's really causing the difference. All right. So let's talk, we're getting into meat consumption. Meat consumption has been associated with colon cancer. Here we're looking at a very elegant piece of data. It looks at meat consumption per grams per person per day, average meat consumption in the country, compared to the colon cancer risk. And we see a direct relationship between meat consumption and colon cancer, that particular type of cancer, a very clear correlation. Yeah. Now that said, correlation isn't always causation, right? So just because the two are correlated doesn't necessarily mean that meat consumption is causing colon cancer. There's lots of ideas out there on what's going on here. First off, the association is strongest when we look at red meat. It's not as strong when we look at poultry and fish consumption. So those individuals who eat more red meat seem to have a higher risk for colon cancer than those who eat less red meat, even if they're eating fish and poultry. So it seems to be that red meat is definitely a higher risk than other types of meat. So one of the questions to ask about that is saturated fat. Red meat has a higher saturated fat content than poultry or fish. So that correlation is out there that perhaps it's the saturated fat that's causing the difference. We know that high-fat diets cause a release of chemicals from the liver, and those can be associated, can be carcinogenic. So high-fat This is the whole anti-Atkins portion of the lecture here. So, high-fat diets cause the release of lithocholic acid from your liver. Lithocholic acid is carcinogenic. It does cause mutations, and it does raise cancer risk, particularly of liver cancer. Raises liver cancer risk.
Is it secreted into the bile?
Yes. Yeah, and it can be circulated through the rest of the body. So we know that this particular carcinogen coming from the liver, lithocholic acid, is associated with liver cancer. Is that somehow causing a correlation to colon cancer is the next question. No proof yet, but that's an interesting idea that it's actually the same release that we see happening from normal high-fat diets. Other ideas that are out there, low produce. Those that eat a high meat consumption tend to eat less fruits and veggies. And remember, fruits and veggies are anti-carcinogenic on their own. So it could be as simple as that. Eating more of one thing, less of the other. We know the other is anti-carcinogenic. Make sure I said everything here. High calorie. Especially red meat is higher in calories than when we look at other sources of protein. And we know that the cancer risk goes up with calorie intake. So those people who eat more average calorie intake per day have a higher risk. So higher risk with high calorie intake. And of course, red meats have higher calories than other types of protein sources. Now, what's causing this effect is not entirely clear either. We know that obesity raises cancer risk of all different kinds of cancers. So without a doubt, obesity raises cancer risk. The question is, what's going first? What's coming first? The horse or the cart? The chicken or the egg? That's what I'm trying to say. Sorry. So yeah, we know obesity causes high cancer risk. That could be the association with high-calorie diets. Also, obesity rates are higher for those who eat more red meat. So it's difficult to tease apart what is the actual cause of this effect. We know without a doubt that these individual things are true, but what came first and what's causing the other is unclear. Obesity increases your cancer risk. High-calorie intake increases your cancer risk, but of course if you have a high-calorie intake, you're more likely to be obese, right? If you eat more red meat, you're more likely to have a high-calorie intake, you're more likely to be obese. It's hard to figure out what's coming first and what's causing that risk factor. The last one, which is one that you had brought up on cooking technique, that's another possible factor in looking at this. It turns out that meats that are cooked over high heat, they release fat droplets, right? Those fat droplets fall on the heating source and release hydrocarbons that are known to be possibly carcinogenic. So, fat droplets, so fat droplets come off the meat, lands on the cooking source, and it releases this smoke that includes fat smoke. It's kind of a weird way to say that, but you guys know what I'm talking about, the smoke from the fat, right? So fat smoke releases hydrocarbons, a particular type of hydrocarbons, which are carcinogenic. If we were to inject those hydrocarbons directly into animals, we'll see that they are carcinogenic, therefore raising your cancer risk. In fact, they took this one step further, and they found that people who prefer their meat cooked well done have higher cancer risk than those who prefer it less well done. So it appears that the kind of char that forms on the outside is partially these hydrocarbons that come up and cover the outside of the meat. They will release some hydrocarbons. Yeah, so like frying and things like that, that's what you're thinking of? Those high temperature cooking techniques like frying will also release these hydrocarbons, and that's likely to be what's happening. Oh, trans fats. Trans fats are associated with heart disease, but I don't know that they've been associated with any particular type of cancer. I have to look it up. Yeah, when it gets really hot, it releases the exact same thing, these hydrocarbons that then get trapped in the food, and you're eating the same exact issue. I mean, and then there was acrylamide that was identified in French fries and all sorts of things. So higher heat cooking techniques release those. And things that create that kind of char on the outside of the meat, like all the good stuff, like come out like if you're cooking ribs or whatever, all the good char on the outside of the meat, that's loaded with these hydrocarbons that come from the little fat droplets that create the smoke on the surface of the meat. So yeah, so far we're down to no cigarette smoking, right? Watch alcohol consumption. Fruits and veggies, good, right? Red meat, limited. So let's talk about something you can't avoid, shall we? Radiation. Radiation and cancer. Several different kinds of radiation associated with the development of cancer. Ultraviolet radiation is definitely the most common cause of cancer in the United States. Skin cancers are our most common form of cancer, and they're almost always caused by ultraviolet radiation, linked strongly to skin cancers. In fact, they can show correlation between the time you spent in the sun and your risk for skin cancer. They can show geographical areas that have more direct sunlight exposure and skin cancer risk. So the areas of the country where they have the most sun exposure is where you see the highest skin cancer risk. So they can show all kinds of data to link it through epidemiology. Those people who have darker skin tones, they have more pigments in their skin. Pigments naturally absorb UV radiation, and so they are at a lower risk than someone who is much fairer skin. They don't have that same pigment to absorb those ultraviolet radiation rays. Now, the bad news is that it's out there, it's everywhere, you can't avoid it. Walking across the street to Starbucks, you get ultraviolet radiation exposure. And it does cause the most common form of cancers, which are skin cancers. The good news, however, is that while these are very, very common cancers, they almost never metastasize. Metastasis is very uncommon in skin cancers, in most forms of skin cancer. There are a few exceptions to that, but most forms of skin cancer don't commonly metastasize. And because they form on the surface of your skin, they're relatively easy to get rid of and control. So if we had to choose one that's the most common, it's not a bad one to choose because they are relatively easy to remove. The other good news about ultraviolet radiation is it is not penetrating. It cannot penetrate through tissues. It cannot penetrate through clothing. It cannot penetrate beneath your skin. It does not pass through any of those areas. So, for example, you go out and you get a sunburn and you have your t-shirt line. That's because UV radiation can't go through the cloth of the t-shirt. Sunscreens block it, glass blocks it. It's not a penetrating form of radiation, so it's relatively easy to block. Ionizing radiation. Ionizing radiation, however, is penetrating. It penetrates through the skin, and it's most commonly linked to internal cancers of various types, as opposed to external. Now, in the early 1900s, early X-ray researchers, when X-ray technology was first being developed, these early researchers working in it developed incredibly high cancer rates. So people who worked around X-rays had a really high risk for cancer, and so they started to test that on animals, and they found that indeed exposure to X-rays raises your cancer risk pretty significantly. It's scary. My major professor in grad school told me about when he was a kid, they would, like when you go to get your kids new shoes, you know, and you put the shoes on their kid and your kid swears up and down they're comfortable, and then you take them home and they say that they're not comfortable anymore. I don't know if you guys experience that phenomenon. It's very annoying. But anyway, so I guess what they would do is they would try the shoes on the kid, and then the kid would put his feet in a little box, and it would actually x-ray them, and it would show you how much space there is in there, so you would know if it fits them well or not. I mean, this is like overuse of technology. This is what always happens, is we develop something and think, oh, okay, how can we use this all the time, constantly? Of course, we don't do that anymore. Now we understand that X-rays actually raise your risk for various types of internal cancers, so you utilize them rarely. This is a balancing act with people like your dentist. You need to get X-rays, but you don't want to do it too often because it can raise your risk of various different types of internal cancers. The other thing I had, so both forms of radiation cause DNA damage and mutation, slightly different in how they do that. We'll talk about that. But they both do form DNA damage and eventually cause mutations that can lead to cancer. The one I didn't put on here, but I probably should have, is nuclear radiation that comes from radioactivity. Very famously, Marie Curie, who along with her husband identified several naturally radioactive occurring isotopes. Radon and polonium are the two that they radium and polonium are the two that they discovered. Worked a lot with that natural radioactivity, researching radioactivity. She died of leukemia, and now we know that the particular type of leukemia she had is highly associated with radioactivity exposure. And she died young because of that exposure. Also, if we look at populations of people who lived through the atomic bombs, right, we see a much higher risk for different types of cancer as well, indicating that radioactivity definitely raises your risk. Now, most people's exposure to radiation is actually from normal sources. There are places where these gases and things come out of the Earth's crust, and we are exposed to them on a daily basis. But high exposure is where you really see that risk. So exposure to that radioactivity, either through atomic bomb or working with these radioactive isotopes. Ionizing radiation, this is the X-rays. It would also be like cathode rays are ionizing radiation.
Wasn't a big concern is radon in basements because there's no circulation
and it's coming naturally out of the Earth's crust, and you're not circulating the air.
And
yeah.
You breathe it in.
And the biggest problem is exactly that is it's naturally coming out of the Earth, but you don't want to be trapped in large amounts for any long time period.
It breaks down with plutonium and some other stuff too, right?
There are a number of them, and in fact, I saw a chart somewhere. I'll have to look back online and see where I saw it, where it maps the parts of the United States that have the highest natural release of radioactive gases and such, and where they're coming from, where the exposure is highest. I think it was parts of the Southwest, the American Southwest, and like up around Yellowstone is where you saw that.
I remember reading too that it was found commonly in concrete.
I don't know. Possibly if it was trapped in the concrete as they make it, would be how it could possibly be there, which would be a problem for internal when people use concrete inside. All right. Another item that we know can cause cancer. This was actually revolutionary because once they started to identify the types of things that cause cancer, they were identifying various different chemicals. The idea that it could be an infectious agent that was causing the cancer was really revolutionary. This was discovered by a guy named Roos, R-O-U-S. He was a veterinarian and researcher working in a rural area, and a chicken farmer came to him with a bunch of dead chickens. These chickens kept dying of sarcoma. right? They kept dying of this particular type of cancer. And so what he did was he tried to figure out, why is this sweeping through a population? What is happening in this particular population? So what he did is he took a tumor from a chicken that had the sarcoma, he ground it up, right, and then he filtered it so that there's no cells left. The only thing that's left is the fluid that would come from that grinding up. Bacteria would get caught in that filter, but viruses are very small and viruses would be able to pass. He took the fluid, he injected it into a healthy chicken, and that chicken got the sarcoma. So he was identifying what we now call the Rous sarcoma virus. And this was the first one that was associated with cancer. And he discovered this in 1911 by working with chickens in his local population. He was sort of laughed at for a long time. They didn't believe that it actually could be an infectious agent. But since then, data has shown that there are actually several oncogenic viruses, several viruses that are associated with the development of cancer. The Epstein-Barr virus, Epstein-Barr virus that causes mononucleosis, is also associated with a type of lymphoma called Burkitt's lymphoma. I'm going to go into more detail in a future chapter, in a future lecture on this. It's really fascinating because of all weird things. You have to be infected by this virus and malaria at the same time to get this type of cancer. It's very bizarre. To get this cancer, you have to be exposed to both malaria and this Epstein-Barr virus. And it's associated with this type of lymphoma. Hepatitis B viruses and hepatitis C viruses are both associated with liver cancer, the development of liver cancer. They're both cancers that infect the liver, and they do increase your risk for liver cancer dramatically. The one we talked about briefly before, human papillomavirus, and its association with cervical cancer, cancer of the cervix, the lower portion of the uterus. It's also now associated with penile and anal and throat cancers as well, the human papillomavirus. In all cases, this seems to be a different phenomenon than what we saw previously. When we were talking about chemicals, they caused mutations, and the mutations led to eventual cancer. That's not what's happening with these viruses. With these viruses, they're actually introducing a new gene into that host cell. And that gene gives some ability that eventually can cause cancer. That's how we talked about it before with human papillomavirus. It's protein E6 that was leading to the destruction of P53. So with these viruses, it appears it's actually that they're bringing in some new gene, some new protein that leads to the development of cancer, as opposed to mutating the genes that you've already got. That seems to be what's happening with these organisms. Even newer is the idea that there are chronic infections that can lead to cancers. Helicobacter pylori and stomach cancer. This is a bacteria. Helicobacter pylori is a bacteria that has been associated with stomach ulcers. People are at a much higher risk for stomach ulcers if they have this infection. And if they have a stomach ulcer, their risk for stomach cancer goes up. That's probably because of an inflammatory response, and this is true for the worms too, parasitic worms and intestinal cancers. If you have a long-term infection in the gastrointestinal tract, the intestines, or the stomach, it appears that that long-term inflammation can trigger the development of cancer. So because the infection's been going on so long, your immune response can cause damage that eventually arises in cancer.
What if there are other things that can damage the, like if you're sick with intolerance?
Well, the perfect way to look at that would be like Crohn's disease or something like that, where you have long-term inflammation. And I don't know if they've investigated a cancer risk between autoimmune disease like Crohn's.
Yeah,
I would think I would think so, because it is an inflammatory process, and I would think anytime you have long-term, have you seen data on it? Okay, so long-term, so Crohn's disease and colon cancer, I would think anytime you have long-term inflammation, it's going to raise your risk, especially for sensitive tissues like the intestinal tract.
Doesn't the presence of parasites and worms dampen the inflammatory response
Yes, so it is more complex than I'm making it out to be.
Which is why we use it for Crohn's disease, because it dampens the inflammatory.
It dampens the new responses in favor of old responses, so different types of immune responses that will trigger one type instead of the other is what happens with that. But yeah, this long-term inflammation event can cause your body to respond with so much damage that eventually cancer arises. It's a very similar phenomenon to what we saw with alcohol, because it's proliferation of new tissues in response to the damage that's going to trigger the development possibly of cancers. So kind of pulling everything together here, the main causes of cancer, if we look at them, tobacco causes about 33% of all cancers. Diet, about 30% are associated there. That includes all the things we've talked about. Other major forms here, ionizing radiation, ultraviolet radiation, various different pollutions and additives, alcohol about 3%, infectious agents about 9%, and then that kind of scary category, the unknown causes there. So really the major causes are age, of course. Age is number one. All other data has to be age normed, because we know age is highly associated. And after that, we're looking at chemicals, radiation, infectious agents, and about 10% heredity. Remember, heredity is very small in that picture. So next time, I'm going to go through and talk about the actual mutations that some of these chemicals cause and how that can result in cancer. I want to remind you, Thursday, I will not be here. You will not be here, because Thursday I will have a recorded lecture, and that's true for Tuesday as well. Thursday I'm in Irvine, and Tuesday I'm on Kansas City. So Thursday and Tuesday will both be online lectures, but not actually here on campus. All right, let me stop this so it'll upload.